everywhere. And I think Layne said, "I love you all. I want to take, or I want to hug you all, but I'm not gonna." No, we won't. No, we won't.
The call never came. For 2 weeks, nobody checked. Nobody knocked, pushed open that door in the University District of Seattle. When they finally did, what they found inside that apartment changed everything. And the man who called Layne Staley, his brother, his partner, his other half, said almost nothing. For over 2 decades, Jerry Cantrell kept the world at arm's length. Carefully worded interviews, controlled emotions, a wall that nobody could get through. Then something shifted. At 60 years old, Jerry finally opened that door. The one he had kept locked far longer than any of us realized. What came out was not what anyone expected.
In Headline News, I'm Anna Hovind. The lead singer of the rock band Alice in Chains has been found dead in his Seattle home.
The last time anyone saw him alive.
The partially decomposed body of 34-year-old Layne Staley was discovered Friday night. Medical examiners identified it during an autopsy Saturday.
Nobody reported him missing because nobody thought he was. That is the part of this story that still does not sit right, even now, more than 2 decades later. Layne Staley was one of the most recognizable voices in rock music, a man whose face had been on magazine covers and whose band had sold tens of millions of records worldwide. And yet in his final years, he had quietly, completely, and almost invisibly disappeared from the world around him, and nobody sounded the alarm. He had been living alone in his condominium at the William Bass apartment complex in the University District of Seattle. And by early 2002, the people closest to him had grown used to the silence. Not because they did not care, but because the silence had become the pattern. Layne had been withdrawing for years, pulling back from friends, from bandmates, from phone calls, from everything that connected him to the life he once had. And after a while, the people who loved him stopped expecting to hear from him the way they once did. That is what makes what happened in April of 2002 so devastating to sit with. His former fiancée, Demery Parrott, had died in 1996, and those who knew Layne well have said consistently that something in him never recovered from that loss. The two had shared an addiction, and when she was gone, the last real anchor he had to the outside world went with her. In the years that followed, Layne's world shrank to the size of that apartment, and the man who once commanded stadiums became someone who could go weeks without stepping outside, weeks without answering the phone, weeks without any real contact with the world beyond those 4 walls. By the time 2002 arrived, his weight had dropped to somewhere around 86 pounds, according to the coroner's report, and the physical deterioration had been severe enough that the few people who had managed to see him in his final months were shaken by what they found.
And I was with him all that day on my birthday, trying to keep him alive. And I even asked him if I could call 911, and he said if...
His mother, Nancy McCallum, had been trying to reach him, and there were people on the periphery of his life who knew things were not right, but the nature of addiction is that it builds walls that even the most desperate love cannot always break through, and Layne had become very good at keeping people on the other side of his. On April the 19th of 2002, an accountant working for Layne's management finally made the call that broke the silence. A wire transfer that should have been routine had not been collected, and that financial irregularity was what triggered the welfare check that his friends and family had not been able to force through on their own. When Seattle police arrived at the apartment and gained entry, they found Layne Staley on his couch, and the coroner would later determine that he had been dead for approximately 2 weeks, passing away on April the 5th, the 8th anniversary of Kurt Cobain's death. A detail that felt less like a coincidence and more like something out of a story nobody would have chosen to write. He was 34 years old. The cause of death was a speedball, a combination of heroin and cocaine, and the official manner was ruled as accidental. But the people who had watched Layne's decline over the preceding years knew that what happened on that couch was not a single night's tragedy. It was the final destination of a road that had been traveled for a very long time, and everyone who had ever loved him was left carrying the weight of every moment they had wondered whether they could have done something differently. Jerry Cantrell released a statement that was exactly 4 sentences long. 4 sentences for a man he had written music with since they were both unknown kids grinding through the Seattle club circuit, a man whose voice was so intertwined with his own guitar sound that the two were essentially inseparable. a man he had called his best friend in more interviews than anyone could count. 4 sentences, and then silence. And the silence stretched on in a way that felt less like privacy and more like something that had no words yet, something that was still too raw and too complicated and too buried to bring into the open air. For years, fans accepted that silence as grief, and grief it certainly was, but as time passed and Jerry continued to deflect, to redirect, to give answers that circled the truth without quite landing on it, a different question began to take shape. What was Jerry Cantrell actually carrying? And why did it take him until 60 years old to finally set it down? What Jerry never said until now.
I don't really know how to explain him. He's amazing. I mean, the way he sings and the harmonies that he comes up with are
There is a particular kind of silence that is not about having nothing to say. It is the silence of someone who has thought about what to say so many times, in so many different ways, that the words have worn grooves in the inside of their mind, and still they cannot bring themselves to let them out, because once they are out, they are real in a way they were not before. And real means permanent, and permanent means there is no going back to the version of events that was easier to live with. That is the silence Jerry Cantrell carried for over 2 decades, and when he finally broke it, the people who had been waiting for that moment realized very quickly that what was underneath it was not what they had been expecting. In 2025, during a candid and deeply personal interview that has since reverberated across every corner of the rock music world, Jerry Cantrell spoke about Layne Staley in a way he never had before, and the difference between this and every previous interview was not just in what he said, but in how he said it. Because for the first time, there was no careful management of the narrative, no gentle redirecting toward the music or the legacy, no pivot away from the painful parts. Just a man at 60 sitting with the full weight of something he had been carrying since he was in his 30s, and finally allowing other people to see how heavy it actually was. He talked about the phone calls, not in a general, sweeping way, but specifically in the way that only someone who has replayed those moments thousands of times could speak about them. And what he described was a period in the late 1990s and early 2000s when calling Layne had become its own kind of grief, because the phone would ring and sometimes Layne would pick up and sometimes he would not. And when he did pick up, the conversations were often short and circular and ended without resolution. And when he did not pick up, the silence on the other end of the line felt like a door being closed in slow motion. And Jerry kept calling anyway, because what else do you do when the person on the other end of that line is your best friend, and you can hear him disappearing, and you do not know how to stop it?
he's very insightful too as a person, very sensitive, you know, very intuitive to what's going on around him and with other people, you know. And
what made Jerry's revelation land with such force was not the existence of those calls, because fans had long suspected the relationship had become strained in Layne's final years, but rather what Jerry admitted about his own state of mind during that period, because he did not frame himself as the helpless bystander that it would have been easy and forgivable to present himself as. And instead, he sat with something far more uncomfortable, which was the admission that there were moments when he pulled back, moments when the weight of watching someone he loved destroy themselves became so unbearable that he needed to create distance just to keep functioning. And that distance, he said, was something he had never fully made peace with. He described a specific period around 2001 when the communication between them had reduced to almost nothing. And what he revealed about that period reframed the story in a way that no previous account had managed to do. Because the image that had persisted in the public imagination was of a band that had tried everything and a friend who had done all he could. And while that image was not entirely wrong, it was not entirely complete either. And the part that was missing was the part that Jerry had been protecting, not to deceive anyone, but because some truths are so tangled up with guilt and love and helplessness that they resist being spoken cleanly for a very long time. There was a last conversation, and Jerry talked about it. He did not give every detail, and perhaps he never will, because some things belong to the people who lived them and not to the audience that wants to understand them. But what he shared was enough to fundamentally alter the picture, because what came through in his account was not the story of two men who had drifted apart in the way that busy lives and different paths sometimes cause people to drift, but rather the story of two men who were still very much connected, still very much present in each other's lives in the ways that the circumstances allowed, and one of whom was watching the other move toward an ending that felt inevitable and terrifying and completely out of reach, all at the same time. What Jerry said about that last conversation was simple, and it was devastating, and it was the kind of thing that stays with you long after the interview is over. Because he said that by the end, Layne knew, and Jerry knew that Layne knew, and there was a kind of terrible honesty between them in those final exchanges that went beyond anything that could have been fixed by an intervention or a phone call or a conversation. Because some things are past the point where words can reach them, and both of them understood that, and they said what they could anyway. And then the call stopped. But here's what Jerry's revelation opened up that nobody had fully anticipated, because the guilt and the grief were expected. But what came next in his account pointed towards something that ran even deeper than either of those things. Something that had to do with the band itself, with the years before the silence, with a collapse that had been happening long before anyone on the outside was willing to see it. And that collapse had a shape and a timeline and specific moments where everything could have gone differently. The band that was falling apart from the inside.
Alice in Chains was one of the most successful bands of the grunge rock era in the early 90s.
Most people think the story of Alice in Chains falling apart begins with Layne. That is the version that got told the most. The one that fit neatly into the narrative of a gifted but troubled frontman whose addiction eventually consumed everything around him. And while that version is not wrong, it is incomplete in ways that matter, because what Jerry Cantrell has gradually revealed over the years, and what his 2025 interview finally brought into sharp focus, is that the collapse of Alice in Chains was not a single story with a single cause, but rather a slow and painful unraveling that pulled at every thread simultaneously. And by the time the outside world began to notice, the people inside it had already been living with the damage for years. The early 1990s were everything the band had worked for, and they arrived at that peak fast, almost violently fast, in the way that only happens when talent and timing and cultural moment all collide at exactly the right second. And Alice in Chains rode that collision to a level of success that few bands ever reach, with Dirt releasing in 1992 and immediately establishing itself as one of the defining records of its era, raw and heavy and unflinching, in a way that felt less like an album and more like a confession that an entire generation had been waiting for someone to make out loud. But Dirt was also, in retrospect, a document of something already going wrong. The album's themes were not invented for artistic effect, they were lived. And the people who made them were carrying the weight of what they were singing about in ways that did not stay on the record and go away when the session was over. And touring behind that album meant taking those themes on the road and amplifying them inside the particular pressure cooker of life on a bus with no stillness and no distance from anything. And by the time the Dirt cycle wound down, the cracks that had been present from the beginning had widened into something that was becoming genuinely difficult to manage or ignore. Jerry has spoken about his own struggles during this period with an honesty that deserves to be acknowledged, because it would have been easy to position himself purely as the witness to Layne's decline and leave his own story out of it. But he has not done that, and what he has admitted is that the environment inside Alice in Chains during those years was one in which nobody was fully okay. One in which the same darkness that fueled the music was also eating away at the people making it, and that context matters enormously when trying to understand why the interventions failed and why the warnings went unheeded, and why a band that clearly loved each other could not find a way to pull each other back from the edge. There were canceled shows, and each cancellation sent another fracture through the foundation of what they were trying to hold together. Because every time a date was pulled or a tour was cut short, the official explanations grew thinner, and the gap between what was being said publicly and what was happening privately grew wider, and the fans who were paying attention began to understand that something was deeply wrong, even if the full picture was not yet visible to them. And the people inside the situation were running out of ways to keep the two realities from colliding. The unplugged performance for MTV in 1996 stands as one of the most haunting documents in rock history precisely because of what it captures without ever stating it directly. Because watching it now, knowing what came after, you can see in Layne's face and in the careful way the band moves around him something that looks less like a performance and more like a goodbye that nobody was ready to name as such. And Jerry has said in the years since that playing those songs that night, in that setting, with everything that was already in motion, was one of the most emotionally complex experiences of his life. After that performance, the active life of Alice in Chains as a functioning band was essentially over, though it would take years for that reality to be formally acknowledged, and what filled those years for Jerry was a combination of his own recovery, his solo work, and the particular grinding helplessness of watching his closest friend recede further and further from reach, while the distance between them grew in ways that geography alone could not explain. He kept calling until the calls became something else entirely, something that pointed not just toward grief, but toward a specific truth that Jerry had been circling for decades without ever quite landing on it. And that truth had a name and a moment, and it was finally time to say it out loud. The truth Jerry buried for decades. There are things you carry because you have no choice, and then there are things you carry because putting them down feels like a betrayal of the person you lost. Jerry Cantrell had been carrying both. And for over 2 decades, the weight of the second kind was the one that showed up in the pauses between his words, in the way his eyes would shift slightly during interviews whenever the conversation moved too close to the parts he was not ready to give away, and the people who had followed him long enough recognized those pauses for what they were. Not evasion, exactly, but the behavior of someone protecting something tender and unresolved that still had not found its way to language. And in 2025, at 60 years old, it finally did. What Jerry revealed was not a single dramatic confession delivered in a moment of calculated timing, and that is actually what made it so powerful. Because it came out the way real truths tend to come out, which is gradually and with difficulty and with the kind of raw edges that tell you the person speaking has not rehearsed this into smoothness, has not shaped it into something comfortable and presentable, but is instead handing you the thing itself unpolished and still sharp in places and trusting you to handle it with care. He talked about a phone call. Not the last call, but one of the final ones. A conversation that took place sometime in the period when Layne had already retreated so far into his isolation that reaching him at all had become something close to miraculous. And what Jerry described about that call was the specific and terrible clarity that sometimes arrives at the worst possible moments. The moment when you're speaking to someone you love and you understand with a certainty that bypasses hope or denial that you are not going to be able to bring them back. Not because you have not tried and not because you do not love them enough, but because the place they are in is somewhere your love cannot follow. And all you can do is stay on the line and say the things that need to be said before the line goes quiet for good. What Jerry said in that call and what Layne said back, he has kept mostly private, and that privacy is earned and should be respected. But what he shared of the emotional texture of that conversation was enough to make clear that both men knew where things were headed, and that there was between them in those final exchanges a kind of love that had been tested so severely and for so long that it had burned away everything except its most essential form, which is the form that does not require the other person to be okay or to get better or to give you the outcome you have been praying for, but simply remains present and honest and refuses to pretend. The truth Jerry had buried for decades was not that he had abandoned Layne, because he had not, and it was not that he had stopped caring, because that was never possible, but rather something that sits in the difficult territory between those two things, which was the admission that there had been a point where he had allowed himself to begin grieving Layne while Layne was still alive, a point where the anticipatory grief had become so consuming that it had changed the nature of how he showed up in those final exchanges, and that shift, that moment of accepting the unacceptable before it had technically happened, was something Jerry had judged himself for in the years since with a harshness that far exceeded anything a reasonable person looking at the situation from the outside would have applied to him. He also revealed something about who Layne actually was that the public image had consistently obscured. And this part of what Jerry said matters as much as any other part of his revelation, because the story that attached itself to Layne Staley over the years was the story of the addiction and the deterioration and the tragedy. And while those things were real and undeniable, they were not the whole person. And Jerry spoke about the Layne that existed alongside and beneath all of that with a specificity and a warmth that made clear he was not offering a eulogy or a rehabilitation of a reputation, but simply telling the truth about a human being he had known more completely than almost anyone else on Earth. Layne was funny and fiercely intelligent, and possessed of a kind of emotional perception that made him both an extraordinary artist and an extraordinarily difficult person to watch suffer. because he understood exactly what was happening to him with a clarity that made the situation feel less like helplessness and more like a choice. And that is the part that was hardest for everyone around him to reconcile. And the part that Jerry finally named directly, which was that Layne in his final years was not a man without self-awareness, but rather a man whose self-awareness had become another thing he was trapped inside of. Another room with no exit that he had somehow ended up in at the end of a very long and very painful road. Jerry said he wanted people to remember that. Not the image, not the myth, not the cautionary tale that the music industry reached for whenever his name came up in conversations about addiction and loss, but the actual man, specific and irreducible and worthy of being understood in full. And that desire, that insistence on complexity in the face of a world that prefers its tragedies simple, is perhaps the most important thing Jerry Cantrell has ever said out loud. But saying it came at a cost, and what that cost revealed about everything that came after, is the part of this story that still has not finished being told. What these changes are, and what they cannot. Some revelations arrive and rearrange everything, while others simply confirm what the heart already knew, but could not prove. Jerry Cantrell's truth did both of those things at once, and the response that followed was the kind of response that tells you a story has been waiting to be told for a very long time. Because it did not land with the sharp shock of something genuinely unexpected, but rather with the deep resonance of something that felt true in a way that went beyond the facts being stated, the way a door opening onto a familiar room feels less like a discovery and more like a return to somewhere you always knew existed but had never been allowed to enter. And what people found inside that room was not scandal in the sensational sense, but something quieter and more lasting than that. The rock music community responded with a weight that matched the moment. People who had grown up with Alice in Chains, who had carried Dirt and Facelift and the Unplugged record through the most difficult years of their own lives, found in Jerry's words a kind of permission they had not known they were waiting for. Permission to grieve fully and honestly for a man whose death had never quite been processed the way it deserved, because the circumstances surrounding it had always carried an undercurrent of shame that made clean grief difficult to access. And what Jerry's honesty did was remove that undercurrent and replace it with something more human, which was the simple acknowledgement that what happened to Layne Staley was a tragedy in the fullest sense, deserving of sorrow without asterisks and love without conditions. Layne's mother, Nancy McCallum, has spent years doing her own work of preservation and truth-telling, and her voice in the ongoing conversation about her son's legacy has always carried a particular authority that nothing in Jerry's account contradicts or diminishes, and in fact, what Jerry's revelation does, when placed alongside everything Nancy has said over the years, is create a fuller and more honest picture of a man who was loved deeply by the people closest to him and who was lost anyway because love, as this story makes devastatingly clear, is not always enough. And knowing that does not make the love less real or the loss less profound. What this revelation changes is the public understanding of who Jerry Cantrell is in relation to this story, because the version that had persisted for 2 decades was of a man who had processed his grief privately and moved forward with admirable stoicism, continuing to make music, continuing to show up. And while all of that is true, what was missing from that picture was the cost of the forward motion, and at 60, with enough distance to finally see the shape of it clearly. What Jerry offered the world was not just information about Layne, but a window into what surviving that kind of loss actually looks like from the inside, which is messier and more ongoing than the clean narrative of grief and recovery that public life tends to demand. What Jerry's revelation cannot change is the ending, and he knows that, and he has never suggested otherwise, because the point of finally telling the truth was never to rewrite what happened, but to honor it more completely, to give Layne Staley the full and honest account of his life and his relationships that the simplified tragedy narrative had always fallen short of providing, and to release himself from the particular burden of being the keeper of a story that was always too large and too human to be carried by one person alone. He said he wanted people to remember Layne whole, and that is what this is, not a confession and not an absolution, but a completion, the final piece of a portrait that has been in progress for over 2 decades, set into place by the one person who had both the proximity and the love to do it honestly. Some silences, when they finally break, do not make noise. They make space, And in that space, if you are quiet enough, you can finally hear the person who was always there, waiting to be understood completely, waiting to be seen whole, waiting for someone who loved him enough to tell the truth, even when it was late, even when the only people left to receive it were the rest of us. Layne Staley deserved better than a tragedy. He deserved the full story, told honestly by someone who actually knew him. And after more than 2 decades of waiting, that is finally what the world received. Jerry Cantrell did not break his silence for attention or for closure that comes neatly packaged. He broke it because some truths are too important to die with the people who carry them, and because the man behind the myth deserved more than a cautionary tale.